Hello everyone, and welcome to the channel. Before we dive into today's story, we just wanted to take a quick second to say thank you all for watching. We truly appreciate your support. If you're new here, please consider subscribing, it's totally free, and hit the notification bell so you never miss out on our latest stories. Now, with all that said, let's jump straight into the story.
The day I moved into the apartment on the 7th floor of the Millbrook Heights was the day my life took a turn I never could have anticipated. The building, a relic of the 1970s, had an air of quiet desperation, as if it was holding on to secrets too deep for the casual observer to uncover. I chose it for its affordable rent and the promise of a fresh start, away from the ghosts that had haunted me in my old place. Little did I know, I was stepping into a new kind of nightmare. The apartment itself was quaint, with peeling wallpaper and a musty smell that clung to the air. The landlord, Mr. Johnson, was an old man with a face like a crumpled map and eyes that seemed to see more than he let on. He handed me the keys with a grimace, mumbling something about the place being perfect for me, and I dismissed it as just another quirk of the elderly. As I began to settle in, I found a note tucked between the door and the floor. It was a slip of paper, slightly crumpled, with handwriting that felt both urgent and familiar. "Watch the shadows," it read. "They're not what they seem." At the end of the note it was signed, with the single letter E. I assumed it was a welcome note from a neighbor, perhaps a bit eccentric, and I tossed it into the rubbish bin without a second thought. The days passed, and I settled into a routine, working from home and exploring the city. But on the 5th night, another note appeared. This one was different, its edges frayed and the ink smeared as if it had been carried in the rain before being slipped under my door. "Don't trust anyone. They're watching." Again signed, with the single letter E, it said, followed by a date in the future, October 12, 2024. Today was September 3, 2023. I examined the note closely, trying to decipher the handwriting. The letter E at the end was a simple, almost childlike scrawl, but the message was chilling. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was probably a prank. But the notes kept coming, each more urgent than the last, and each dated from a year into the future. "Find the key under the boiler. It will lead you to the truth." Signed, with the single letter E, October 15, 2024, "Turn off the lights at midnight. Listen." Signed, with the single letter E, October 20, 2024, "Leave while you can. They are coming for you." Again signed, with the single letter E, October 25, 2024, I started to feel like I was in a twisted game of hide-and-seek, but who was hiding, and who was seeking? The most pressing question was, who was he? I decided to do some digging and began by asking Mr. Johnson about the previous tenant. "Mr. Ellis," he said, his voice flat. "He moved out under strange circumstances. I never found out what happened to him. Last I heard, he vanished without a trace." I felt a shiver run down my spine. Vanished? The notes were starting to make sense, or at least, they were beginning to form a pattern. I needed to find out more, but how? The only clue I had was the key under the boiler. That night, after everyone in the building seemed to have settled down, I made my way to the basement. The air was thick and heavy, and the flickering fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows on the walls. The boiler was a massive, ancient thing, its pipes groaning like the breaths of a dying beast. I hesitated, my heart pounding, but the urgency in the notes pushed me forward. I reached under the boiler, my hand brushing against the cold, damp floor, and felt something metallic. I pulled it out, a small, old-fashioned key, with a tag that read 723. Confused, I examined the tag. 723 was my apartment number. I had the key to my own apartment, but why would it be hidden here? As I stood there, the boiler suddenly hissed, and I jumped back, my heart racing. The sound of footsteps echoed through the basement, and I froze. I hadn't heard anyone else come down, and the footsteps were oddly rhythmic, almost like they were counting. I sprinted back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. The notes were becoming more frequent, and I was starting to feel the weight of their warnings. I decided to take the advice of the latest note and turned off the lights at midnight. The darkness enveloped me, and I sat on the edge of my bed, my ears straining for any sound. At first, there was nothing. Then, I heard it, a faint scraping sound, coming from the wall. I held my breath, my eyes wide, and as the sound grew louder, a chill ran down my spine. It was as if something was trying to claw its way through the plaster. I couldn't take it anymore and turned on the lights, the scraping stopping immediately. The next day, I received another note. It's in the walls. They can hear you. Signed, with the single letter E, October 28, 2024, panic began to set in. I started to think about moving, but the thought of starting over, the hassle of finding a new place, and the fear of what might be waiting for me elsewhere kept me in place. I needed to know what was happening, and I couldn't leave until I had answers. I decided to ask my neighbors, but they all seemed to avoid eye contact, their faces turning pale at the mention of the strange occurrences. One of them, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Thompson, finally spoke up. Mr. Ellis was a strange man, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He would talk to himself, and sometimes, I swear I could hear him arguing with someone on the other side of the wall. He left in the middle of the night, and no one has seen him since. The more I learned, the more I realized that the apartment had a dark history. I found a series of old newspaper clippings hidden in the back of a drawer, detailing a series of disappearances in the building over the years. Each victim had been reported last seen in their apartment, and no trace of them was ever found. The article mentioned a rumor about a cult that had once resided in the building, but there was no evidence to support the claim. The notes kept coming, and I began to feel like I was being pulled into a web of intrigue and fear. The cult is still here. They wait for the chosen one. Signed, with the single letter E, October 30th, 2024, chosen one. What did that mean? I was starting to feel like I was in a movie, one of those horror films where the protagonist realizes too late that they are the center of a malevolent plot. I needed to find Mr. Ellis, or at least someone who could help me make sense of what was happening. I spent hours scouring the internet, looking for any mention of Mr. Ellis or the cult. I found a blog post from a local historian who mentioned an old ritual that was believed to have been practiced by a group of individuals in Millbrook Heights. The ritual involved communicating with spirits, and the chosen one was said to be someone who could bridge the gap between the living and the dead. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but I still didn't understand why I had been targeted. I decided to take the next step and visited the local library, where I found an old book about the history of Millbrook Heights. The book mentioned a series of unexplained phenomena that had occurred in the building, and it referenced a room on the 7th floor that had been sealed off after a particularly gruesome incident in the 1970s. The room was said to be a portal, a door that opened to a realm beyond our understanding. The cult had believed that the chosen one would be the one to unlock the portal, and they had been searching for such a person for decades. I realized that Mr. Ellis had been the last to receive the call, and he had tried to warn me. But how could I have been chosen? I wasn't anyone special, just a regular person trying to make ends meet. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the key under the boiler was the key to the sealed room. I had to find out what was inside. That night, I gathered my courage and made my way to the sealed room. It was a small, nondescript door hidden behind a bookshelf, and the padlock was old and rusted. I inserted the key, and it turned with a rusty squeal. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of dust and decay. The room was dark, and I couldn't see a thing. I fumbled for my phone, but the battery was dead. I was trapped, and the fear began to overwhelm me. Then, I heard a voice, low and raspy, coming from the darkness. "Welcome, chosen one," it said. "We have been waiting for you." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was followed by a series of whispering, as if 100 voices were speaking at once. I could feel a presence around me, something ancient and dark, and I knew I had to get out. I stumbled to the door, my hands shaking, and just as I reached for the handle, I felt something grab my ankle. I screamed and kicked, but the grip tightened, and I was pulled into the darkness. The whispers grew louder, and I could hear laughter, cold and cruel. I don't remember much after that. The next thing I knew, I was back in my apartment, lying on the floor, my body aching. The clock on the wall read 3 a.m., and I realized that I had been gone for hours. I checked my phone, and it was full of missed calls and messages from my friends, worried about my sudden disappearance. I staggered to my feet, my mind racing. The room was still sealed, and I couldn't understand how I had gotten out. I decided to play along, to pretend that nothing had happened, and to keep a low profile. But the notes continued, each one more desperate than the last. Run. They are almost ready. Signed with the single letter E, November 2nd, 2024, trust no one. They are everywhere. Signed with the single letter E, November 5th, 2024, save yourself. The final ritual is tonight. Signed with the single letter E, November 10th, 2024, the final note was the most chilling. E had used a red pen, and the message was scrawled across the paper in a frantic, almost terrified script. I knew I had to act, but I didn't know how. That night, I packed a small bag and left the apartment, determined to find Mr. Ellis. I had a feeling that if I could find him, I might have a chance to understand what was happening and maybe, just maybe, stop it. I wandered the city, my mind a blur, and as the clock struck midnight, I found myself standing outside an old, abandoned church on the outskirts of town. The church was dilapidated, its stained glass windows shattered, and the door was hanging by a single hinge. I stepped inside, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. The interior was dark, but I could make out the shape of a figure standing in the center of the nave. As I approached, the figure turned, and I saw the face of Mr. Ellis, his eyes wild and afraid. "You came," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "I didn't think you'd make it." He explained that the cult had chosen him to unlock the portal, but he had resisted. They had tried to force him, but he had managed to escape, leaving behind the notes as a warning. "They'll come for you next," he said. "You're the chosen one, and they won't stop until they have you." I was terrified, but I also felt a strange sense of determination. If I was the chosen one, then I had to do something. I asked Mr. Ellis what the final ritual entailed, and he explained that it involved a human sacrifice, the chosen one being the key to unlocking the portal fully. We had to stop them, but how? Mr. Ellis took a deep breath and revealed that the only way to break the cycle was to destroy the key. "It's not just a physical key," he said. "It's a symbol, a focus of their power. If you destroy it, the portal will close, and they will be trapped." We made our way back to the apartment, sneaking in just as the first light of dawn began to break. The corridor was eerily quiet, and I could feel the eyes of the other tenants on us, even though no one was visible. We reached the sealed room, and Mr. Ellis handed me a small, ornate box. "The key is inside," he said. "You must destroy it." I opened the box, and the key was there, its surface engraved with strange symbols. I took a deep breath and, with a steady hand, I crushed the key, the metal bending and warping under the pressure of my grip. The room seemed to shudder, and a low, mournful wail filled the air. The walls began to crack, and I could see the shadows moving, as if the darkness itself was being torn apart. Then, everything went silent. The room was still, and the shadows lay still. I turned to Mr. Ellis, who looked relieved but exhausted. "It's done," he said. "They are gone." We left the building, the weight of the cult's presence lifting from our shoulders. As we walked away, I felt a sense of closure, but also a lingering unease. The apartment had changed me, and I knew that I would never be the same again. I looked back at the building, its facade now just a collection of bricks and mortar, and I wondered if the darkness had truly been banished or if it was just waiting for the next chosen one. The notes stopped coming, and I never heard from the cult again. But the memory of that night, the sound of the shadows clawing at the walls, and the feeling of being watched, stayed with me. I moved away from Millbrook Heights, but the story of the chosen one remained, a cautionary tale of the dangers that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the unwary. Let us know in the comments section after the first note, would you have packed up and left? Or would you have stayed? Ready for spine-chilling tales that will haunt your thoughts? Subscribe to Forgotten Storyteller for eerie narrations, unsettling mysteries, and haunting stories you won't forget. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a story, because some stories refuse to stay buried. Join us, if you dare.